2.5 years into one of the deadliest conflicts of the 21st century, Russia teeters on the brink of an economic abyss. The cause? A silent, insidious disease, one that could cripple the nation's future. Not COVID-19, though that too has taken its toll. This is a different kind of disease, one that thrives not in the body, but in the very fabric of Russia's society and economy. It's a disease that's brought down empires before, and now it's festering within Russia's energy-rich veins. This isn't a virus, but its effects are no less devastating. This is the Dutch disease, an economic curse that's resurfaced time and again, pulling nations from power to peril. Russia, it seems, has caught this disease through its vast energy reserves. But how deep does the infection run? How rapidly is it spreading? And could it spell the end for Putin's reign? Let's unravel the mystery. Russia is one of the world's largest suppliers of natural gas and crude oil. However, the country has almost completely realigned its main economic sectors, energy manufacturing and service, towards catering for the needs of extracting and exporting non-renewable energy resources. Sure, this has allowed Russia to start the war relatively unimpeded, allowing it to fuel its war machine with billions of dollars of investments that were diverted from energy exports. However, this reliance on the energy sector as a whole can have widespread consequences that stack one upon another until they bring the country to the brink of collapse. This might finally be enough to remove the ruling class from the head of state and create a revolution in Russia. Let's start with some numbers. Russia has arguably been one of the countries that's bounced back from the effects of COVID-19 fastest, managing to grow its economy while the West stagnated. Even now, in 2024, the Russian economy is growing at a pace of 2.6%, which is more than a full percentage point than the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, predicted at the end of October 2023. Compare this to the economic growth of the EU, Russia's closest ideological and military opponent, which is slated to be only 1%. The figures are starting to paint a slightly dim picture of how the West is doing compared to what is effectively a war economy. But that's not exactly the full story. While the Russian budget is indeed increasing year after year, nearly 40% of the 2024 budget is expected to be spent on military and national defense. This translates to roughly 6% of the country's GDP, a figure unheard of in Western countries. For comparison, the US is projecting that its national defense budget is only 3% of its GDP, while most of Europe is peddling figures around 2.1%. Of course, it pays to take into account that the US total GDP is still magnitudes larger than that of Russia, but the precedent is undeniable. Russia's economy is growing on paper, but the country is wrapping up that growth into its war machine instead of sectors that are more important in the long term: manufacturing, service, and infrastructure. Additionally, the country is pretty much all in on its reliance on trade. Roughly 30% of the country's GDP comes from exports, compared to only 12.5% for the US. As a result, Russia has become increasingly dependent on trade, but those trading partners might not remain partners for long. This falls back to the aforementioned reliance on energy export. Between 2022 and 24, Russian revenue from fuel exports dropped from around 1.360 million in US dollars to 820 million per day, a nearly 40% decrease. This includes the fact that the country is currently on a slight upswing due to increased exports to India and China, arguably two of the largest resource trading partners. The lowest point in the fuel revenue in recent years was in July 2023 at around $680 million per day, roughly half of the revenue at the start of the invasion. This means that the Russian economy, which is already extremely dependent on exporting stuff out of the country, has been exporting fewer energy products for the past few years. Which brings us back to the crux of the issue and the main forecast behind the country's potential collapse: the Dutch disease. Coined in 1977, the Dutch disease is a years-long process where the country's economy suffers due to an unexpected windfall in a specific sector, primarily in natural resources. The disease was named after the Dutch discovered the Groningen natural gas field in 1959. This led to the country's energy sector booming, seemingly with no downsides at first, and the economy received a solid boon over the next few years. This sounds great for the Dutch, right? Wrong. As the energy sector grew, the manpower required to sustain it didn't. The growing demand for workers shifted the availability of manpower from other fields, particularly industry and manufacturing, to employ more people in the energy sector. Economists observed that the manufacturing sector fell rapidly, which caused rapid political discontent in its wake. In general, however, the symptoms of the Dutch disease can vary between one country or economy and the next. The main principles are that a country has at least 3 overlapping sectors, one of which is non-tradable, typically the service sector which supports the internal population, while the others are such as manufacturing, energy, or agriculture. The first symptom of the disease is that one of the tradable sectors experiences a sudden boom. In the case of the Netherlands and Russia, this is the energy sector and is referred to as the resource movement effect. Much like the Dutch discovered a significant deposit of natural resources, Russia has already been working on expanding its energy exports for decades. This has only been exacerbated as Russia has been on the receiving end of more and more embargoes from Western countries. However, the other tradable sectors typically can't compete with this growth. As the booming sector starts requiring more people and investments to maintain this growth, it begins eating away at others, with people transferring sectors for better salaries and more lucrative returns. Effectively, this leads to reducing the level of industrialization, agricultural self-sufficiency, or internal manufacturing. Of course, the energy sector has comparatively few manpower demands compared to manufacturing. The actual or direct deindustrialization can be negligible for most countries affected by the disease, including the Netherlands in the 60s and Russia today. What follows, however, is that the people who were already employed in the energy sector and the few converts from the industry field suddenly have a lot more capital at their disposal. Apart from binding this in investments, the improved spending capability encourages growth in the non-tradable sectors, as the economic processes encourage the newly gained money to be circulated through the population. This leads to increased demands and earnings in the service sectors. Now, this can have a much more significant effect on the manpower availability between the various sectors. Since people generally won't be leaving the booming sector, the growth of the service sector puts even more strain on manufacturing or agriculture as the population shifts from producing products to offering services. This spending effect creates indirect deindustrialization. The same process is currently being applied to Russia, but is exacerbated by the country's ongoing conflict and investment in national defense. Furthermore, as the country's population turns more towards a single tradable sector and a non-tradable one, the country's currency exchange rate might fluctuate. In Russia's case, for example, foreign energy buyers need to transact in rubles and the services are typically paid for in rubles, requiring foreign investors to exchange their currency for rubles. However, this fluctuation in exchange rates can make it more worthwhile for end users to purchase manufactured products from abroad. This creates even more pressure on the non-booming sectors, plunging the country further into reliance on the single booming sector and services to keep the budget afloat. This can be summarized by the volatile ruble exchange rate over the past few years. If we take a look at the 5-year US dollar to ruble exchange rate, the month after the invasion saw the rate skyrocket by nearly 70% to over 120%. A few months later, in March 2022, the rate plunged into a 9-year low, $1 equaling 50 rubles. Based on previous trends, the ruble exchange rate has a bit of a correlation to the price of crude oil and gas. To Russia's credit, the country's government has taken significant steps to reduce the connection between the ruble and fuel prices, with several policies to reduce foreign spending and tie the price of the ruble to the country's gold reserves. But how exactly can a country die from the Dutch disease? Well, while Russia has done as much as possible to disentangle the price of the ruble from the price of natural gas and crude oil, it's still highly dependent on exporting those resources to other countries. As such, the booming energy sector is highly volatile to external changes in the global market. For the simplest example, other oil and gas producing countries such as Iraq, Saudi Arabia, the US or Canada also have significant oil and gas reserves and comparable abilities to export these resources across the world. While Russia arguably has the biggest oil export surplus, the difference between exports and imports, this position can easily be overturned by Saudi Arabia or even the US due to the increasing industrialization and utilization of oil fields in Texas. In a hypothetical situation, Saudi Arabia or the US could start pumping out more oil and gas from their fields and exporting them to countries that Russia traditionally trades with. This could lead to a drop in fossil fuel prices, which could cause Russia's energy sector to lower its investment interests and cease being the booming sector. If that happens and the oil and gas magnates can no longer prop up the sector with their wealth, this deficit will trickle down to the service sector. Without the funding provided by the booming sector, the service sector would become another strain on the country's economy. This will be made worse by the fact that the country has been deindustrialized, with a lack of domestic agriculture and manufacturing capability. For a country with the Dutch disease, the booming sector effectively becomes the lifeline that's keeping the economy afloat. If the sector stops generating revenue, the other sectors will fall around it like a house of cards. This brings about the polarity between Russia's natural resources and its ability to utilize them as a driver behind the country's economy. As mentioned, the country is significantly more dependent on oil and gas exports to power its budget compared to other world economies such as the US, EU, and China. On the other hand, the country's hostile takeovers of various former Soviet territories in the previous decades have severely deteriorated foreign relations with most of the Western world. This has led to a slew of economic sanctions, starting with the 2014 annexation of Crimea and peaking with the full-blown invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Right now, the country is practically barred from trading in US dollars, relying on ruble and yuan trading for the bulk of its import and export needs. Additionally, the sanctions have also led to a centralization of the country's export efforts. This is perhaps most notable in the energy sector. While Russia's oil exports haven't declined noticeably since the start of the 2022 invasion, the range of countries to which Russia exports has been reduced significantly. For example, while the EU was one of the biggest importers of Russian oil and gas, the current trade is less than 20% of pre-invasion numbers. Additionally, Russian exports to the UK and the US, while not particularly significant compared to the bulk of others, have stopped completely. Conversely, China, India, and to a lesser extent Turkey, currently account for more than 65% of Russia's oil exports. This puts Russia in somewhat of a bind, as the countries have the ability to negotiate the prices of Russian resources, allowing them to get lower prices than anywhere else in the world. As an example, the 2023 deal between China and Russia allowed China to get Russian natural gas at nearly half the price than usual. This cements the stranglehold that the global economy is slowly putting on Russia, worsening the potential debilitating consequences of the Dutch disease. Of course, the second symptom of Russia's Dutch disease has been starting to show, particularly in regard to the near monopolization of imported manufactured products. The current trade between China and Russia is yet another such example. China currently accounts for roughly 30% of Russian imports and 38% of exports. In particular, the car market in Russia is represented by around 60% of Chinese vehicles, compared to the measly 9% in February 2022, just before the invasion. A similar concept applies to tractor imports, which are vital for the country's agriculture. As another non-booming sector, Russia's agriculture could take a significant hit if the manufactured products required to keep the industry running are imported from abroad. This ties into the indirect deindustrialization mentioned as one of the symptoms of the disease. But how susceptible is the country to the Dutch disease? As mentioned, the country's GDP growth has arguably stabilized and even exceeded the IMF's expectations. While the country's manufacturing sector has arguably taken a hit, per the Dutch disease hypothesis, the country's weapons and munitions manufacturing increased significantly. For example, Russia has produced more than 67% more ships and aircraft and 46% more non-car motor vehicles throughout 2023 than in the previous year. However, it's not certain whether Russia can actually sustain these efforts for long, as the Western sanctions have also prevented Russia from accessing the newest technologies in the sectors. As a result, Russia can only eventually produce quantity rather than quality, which might not directly correlate to long-term economic growth and prosperity. Sure, China's industrialization in the 20th century led to it becoming one of the biggest economies in the world, but this upheaval is highly unlikely for a country that is already relatively industrialized and disconnected from the Western world. One of the biggest long-term problems that Russia faces in the coming years is its short-term infusion towards military and national defense spending. We already mentioned that roughly 30 to 40% of the government's 2024 budget was allocated to these sectors. This comes at the expense of all others. While the energy sector is relatively safe from downturns due to the sheer availability of resources and interdependence with the Russian economies, others are not likely to fare as well. For example, over 100,000 of the country's IT specialists have emigrated in 2022 alone, and seemingly might not have any plans to return. The total number of emigrants is estimated to be over 800,000, which is also likely to put even more strain on the country's economy in both the short and long term. Not only is this a blow to the country's service sector, but it also reduces the potential manpower Russia can enlist in its war effort against Ukraine. The construction of the national budget on non-military sectors, as well as the country's declining educated population, will likely correlate with a lowered quality of life throughout Russia in the coming years. While it's possible that Russia can reverse course on some of the policies that try to spark a bit of life in the industrial sector, its current focus on powering the war machine and supporting the energy industry makes this prospect unlikely. As a result, Russia is slowly choked by its over-reliance on war and energy exports to support its government and economy. We have to remember that Russia is currently heavily dependent on China for imports and exports. Additionally, the countries have seemingly aligned foreign policies. While this would mean that ideally, Russia could prosper from being under China's wing, this might not be entirely true. You see, China might not be all in on supporting Russia's efforts and bolstering its economy. While the two countries are allies on paper, there's still a bit of bad blood between them in historical context. This is particularly important in the bordering region of Outer Manchuria, which China was forced to cede to Russia after the Opium Wars in the 19th century. The region is extremely far away from the centralized Russian government in the Kremlin. Its population is also roughly 1/20th of the Chinese population in the regions across its border. In recent months, China has started pushing to resolve the issue of Outer Manchuria, at least for the issues it perceived. For example, recent Chinese maps have relabeled Russian cities in the region with their Chinese counterparts or historical names prior to the Russian annexation. The border between Outer Manchuria and China is also composed of two vital rivers, Amur and Ussuri, which can be a significant boon to China's meager water resources. Also, the rivers allow easy access to the Sea of Japan. This would be a vital diversification in China's ability to send maritime trading routes, bypassing the contested South China Sea, which has a bottleneck in the Strait of Malacca. Furthermore, Outer Manchuria could be a staging ground for a more widespread Chinese invasion of Russia to secure better access to Siberian resources. Siberia is particularly important to China due to its abundance of natural resources including drinking water, timber and minerals. All of these are something that China sorely lacks, especially in the northern population centers, which severely lack drinking water, and the booming Chinese manufacturing industries that rely on timber and iron. Siberia's relative remoteness from the Kremlin and the Russo-Ukrainian front means that Russia doesn't exert nearly as much control over the area, leaving it potentially open to Chinese influence. An attempt to seize the reins over the Siberian drinking water supply has been made in the 2010s, with many Chinese companies buying Russian land and attempting to create pipelines from Lake Baikal to the Chinese mainland. The lake is the largest reservoir of freshwater in the world, and the Chinese population could be supplied from it for decades. However, the local Russian government has managed to put a stop to those attempts, removing the Chinese influence in the area, at least for now. With Russia currently experiencing potential economic upheaval and focusing on war attempts in the West, the Siberian regions could be ripe for Chinese picking. Of course, China is currently being held up by the US influence, especially due to the Singaporean stranglehold of the Strait of Malacca, which is used by China's most important maritime trade routes. This puts China in a difficult position where it can't make offensive moves against Russia without the US disrupting its economy by blockading maritime trade. However, China's Belt and Road Initiative aims to reduce its dependence on maritime trade routes and connect it to countries across Asia. If China manages to relieve the pressure from the US, it could feasibly invade Russia to take its natural resources. Apart from removing a large chunk of Russian territory, it would remove the bulk of the Russian trade-based economy, quickening its collapse. But it's not only China that poses a threat to Russia's economy. India is also a significant contender, albeit more indirectly. While China is one of the US's biggest economic and ideological enemies, India has taken a different course in its foreign relations. As part of the quadrilateral security dialogue with the US, Australia, and Japan, India aims to reduce China's economic pressure in the region. As a result, India has been separating itself from China's economy and increasing its presence in the Indian Ocean, which allows it to control the Strait of Malacca indirectly. India has also started to cut itself off from the neighboring countries, which are heavily supported by China. Coupled with the support from the US, India is one of the biggest beneficiaries of the Europe-India corridor. The corridor is a sequence of trading routes that go from Europe across the Mediterranean to the Middle East via rail and maritime routes across the Indian Ocean. If implemented, it would more efficiently connect the US with India. It would also allow India to reduce its resource imports from Russia. India's reluctance to work with Chinese interests means it's likely to also work against Russian interests in the long term. If Russian exports to India slow down or stop, it would mean a significant blow to the Russian economy, effectively jump-starting the collapse heralded by the Dutch disease. With all that said, is there a timeline for how long it takes for the Dutch disease to run its course and cause significant economic upheaval? Unfortunately, the answer is all but simple. The IMF has identified that Russia either caught the Dutch disease all the way back in 2007, or at least had the potential to do so. This would mean that Russia has managed to stave off the negative effects of the process for at least 15 years. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 didn't seem to yield significant adverse reactions to the Russian economy. Due to the EU's dependence on Russian oil and gas at the time, the country was relatively unaffected by major symptoms of the disease. This was thanks to the booming energy sector being allowed to continue to grow and the negative deindustrialization cancelled out by sheer economic growth and incentives. Considering the timeline between the 2007 report, it's possible that the recent years have rapidly accelerated the progress of the disease and sped up the potential for Russian economic decline. If so, there's still some uncertainty as to how much Russia's economy can withstand foreign influence from both the West and its main trading partners, China and India. With Russia getting increasingly cut off from the Western world and the hostilities between NATO and Russia increasing, it's highly likely that China will become the decisive factor. Russia's economy can collapse if China cuts off the vital trade income and/or by outright hostile action. On the other hand, China might actively prop the country's economy to the point of complete dependence, making Russia all but a puppet for the Chinese interests in Eastern Europe. The progressing symptoms of the Dutch disease might prompt China into action, and the results could be devastating. But what do you think about the effect of the Dutch disease in Russia? Is the country's economy on the brink of collapse, and will China and the US capitalize on it? Thank you for watching, and leave your comments below. Now go and check out why Russia is on the edge of total collapse, or click this other video instead.